G'day and welcome back to the channel. So in today's video, I want to go through 3 really simple hip flexor strength exercises that you can do to help contribute to permanently loosening tight hip flexors. So let's get into it. So the reason why I wanted to make this video is to complement a video that I did about 12 months ago called How to Permanently Loosen a Tight Psoas or Tight Hip Flexors. I talk about how just stretching a tight psoas or tight hip flexors on their own can absolutely be helpful, but may never permanently resolve that tightness because it may not be getting to the root underlying cause of why that tightness is there in the first place. And what we went through in that video was obviously some ways to mobilize a tight psoas, but why it's just so important to also free up the lower sections of your spine, because that's where a lot of the hip flexor muscles attach to. Then a lot of the reasons why hip flexors can become tight is because the back itself has become stiff, tight, restricted, and possibly dysfunctional. On top of that, how you sit, how you use that part of your back may also come into the conversation, because if you do tend to slouch a lot and load up a part of your back differently so that it becomes tight and then your hip flexors are tight because of that. If we're freeing up your hip flexors, if we're freeing up your back, but we're not also trying to get you into better postures and shapes, improve how you're loading that spine, then again, it may be unrealistic to expect that your hip flexors will remain loose forever if some of the causes for that tightness are still in the picture. But when recording those previous videos, I hadn't yet brought the strength conversation into this conversation. So I'd like to go through 3 hip flexor strength exercises so that you can have hopefully an even more complete idea of what you need to do to permanently loosen a tight psoas. And if you remember, there'll be an extended cut of this video where there'll be a 4th one that I think is often missed, but is also a very valuable exercise to try if you're trying to strengthen tight hip flexors. So in the case of a tight psoas or tight hip flexors, we want to make sure that we're touching a lot of hip extension, engaging the tissue in that area to not only prompt it to free up, but to tell your brain that you value that new range. Having said that, the first of these videos isn't necessarily going to encroach on that end range into hip extension. It's just going to be a general hip flexor strength muscle exercise. But the next 2 we get to, and the 4th of these exercises that you'll get as a member, we want to have that end range hip extension involved in the conversation. But for this one, the most simple way to start to strengthen your hip flexors is in standing. So hands up against the wall, belly drawn in, up nice and tall, and then lift your knee up as high as you feel comfortable. Now we can kind of come back so that your toes are behind you to sort of come into a hip extended position, but just know that this range here isn't necessarily going to be the range that'll get you stronger. The line of gravity will certainly start to act a little bit more as your knee comes up closer to horizontal. But for the purposes of completing this, take your foot back as far as you can without extending your back backwards. Back stays straight, going all the way back. Back stays straight, coming all the way up. And we want to do your standard 3 sets of 10 to really try and start to generate some fatigue in this position. We can obviously change, do the same thing on the other side, go through the 10, do what you feel you can do. Try and aim for a little bit of fatigue. Again, if you feel like this becomes too easy, we can then add a band. And with a booty band, we can place that band on your feet. Ideally, the smaller the band, the better, because one of the issues with using a band is when we do an exercise with your feet close together like this, there's not a lot of tension on the band in the early stage, and the tension increases the higher up you come. So what I would encourage you to do is if you have your feet sort of somewhat far apart, so there's tension on the band already, then what you'll find is it will be easier for you to generate that tension the whole way through the exercise. Just so you can see, hold on to something and then coming up in this plane. So you're coming up, you're not coming down and taking the tension off the band. You're trying to keep your feet far apart, coming up into this position. Again, belly drawn in, back stays still, nothing moves except your hip. Do your 3 sets of 10 at a resistance that you feel fatigues you. But the real benefit of strength training, especially with the view of permanently loosening a tight psoas, is that we do want to try and incorporate some hip extension into that conversation. So let's do that now. So as we start to progress towards exercises that tend to address some of the end range of your psoas or hip flexor muscle tightness, a really simple exercise you can try is lying down on your back with either your legs off the end of a bed or off the side of a bed. How that looks is we get you with a leg off the edge. If you have a butt cheek off the edge, edge so that we can get into this sort of deeper hip extension range of motion. With your legs straight and your feet pointing upright, we can come down as low as you feel comfortable and then come up as high as you feel comfortable. Now, obviously, thanks to gravity, as your leg comes up closer to vertical, your hip flexors will do less. But the goal of this exercise is to try and get your thigh and your knee and your foot behind the line of your hip to get into the end range of that hip extension to really open up the front of that hip. Again, make sure that your belly is drawn in to stabilize your back and your pelvis. Work up and down as high as you feel comfortable, going as low as you feel comfortable, making sure that as you start to run into some of your hip flexor tightness, you don't let your foot dump out the side to take the tension off. Keeping your foot pointed up will feel a little bit tighter, but that's essentially the point. But as mentioned, this exercise is really good at the end range, but not fantastic at the top. The standing hip flexor strength exercise is potentially a lot better at the top half of the range. It doesn't really do much into those lower hip extension ranges. So one way that we can make that a little bit better again is doing a standing exercise using a band or a cable. So strengthening your hip flexors in standing with a band or ideally a cable on balance can be a better way to hit both corners of that hip flexor range, albeit with its own subtle limitations as well. So while I don't have a cable machine here that I can do this exercise with, a simple TheraBand can also be a fantastic option. If you can secure it tightly to something sturdy and then obviously tie it around your ankle as well, it's a really good substitute. And like the other exercises, what I would like you to do is, again, coming out as far as you feel comfortable with enough tension on the band, up nice and tall, belly drawn in, hold on to something if you need to. We want you to extend your hip as far as you feel comfortable, and then we want to drive your hip forwards as far up as you feel comfortable. Again, the challenge with this is when you extend your hip, we don't want you to bend your back or tilt your pelvis forwards to give you the illusion that you're going back further. We want everything to be in a good position, and we just want you to come back as far as you feel you can before you start to lose that. And then as you drive forwards, we can then bend your knee, making sure again to not round your back at the top, again, changing the way that you do this exercise. So in a perfect world, and assuming I'm doing this perfectly, you want to have your full hip extension and then full hip flexion without losing or compromising your spinal position at the same time. The only drawback about this exercise is because we're using a band, there's a natural peak in the amount of tension the further out you stretch the band. So there's more force going through my hip flexor up here than there is in theory down at this range. Obviously, it's a limitation to the exercise. If you use the cable machine at the gym, you're more likely to have a more uniform tension all the way out throughout that exercise. But one of the ways that you can combat that is that you can sort of break that exercise into those two same components that we showed you before, where you have enough tension on the band in this range, and you can just practice working through this range for a set of 10 or a set of 15. And then if you need to, you can then just work through this higher range at the same resistance for another set of 10 or 15. We also want to make sure that you feel that there's some fatigue created from the exercise, so that you've told your brain that your muscle strength isn't where it could be, so that when you go to sleep and you wake up the next day, it's adapted to that stimulus. And now, if you are a member of the channel, there'll be an extended version of this video where I want to go through one more strength exercise that's a little bit different to what you might expect, that can help you target those end range restrictions, while at the same time strengthening those psoas and hip flexor muscles. So at the end of the day, if your goal is to permanently loosen a tight psoas or tight hip flexors, stretching alone is highly unlikely to get you there on its own. It's still a really valuable piece of the puzzle, but we need to find ways to mobilize something that's become restricted. That may include freeing up your back if that muscle attaches to your back, like your psoas. And because freeing up your back may be important, the shapes and positions that you then put your back into during the things that you do the most, sitting shapes, standing, leaning over shapes, it doesn't matter what it is, those sedentary stationary shapes where you might unknowingly be hinging through the part of your back that's stiff, that also asks your hip flexors and your psoas to become tight. Those things need to get better to give permission for that tightness to never be there again. And on top of that, the stronger you can make your hip flexors, more specifically in that extended position where you're in a lengthened position, these things together will give you the best chance of permanently loosening that tight hip flexor. So please let me know in the comments down below how you found those exercises. Give the other video a watch and let me know how you feel all this fits together in your life. If you did find this helpful and insightful, please consider leaving a like on the video. Subscribe to the channel if you want more of this type of content from me. Please consider becoming a member if you want the extended cuts of these videos as they come out. As always, I genuinely hope that was helpful and hope to see you next time.